Imagine a book so prophetically precise that skeptics claim it must have been written after the events occurred. The Book of Daniel stands as one of Scripture's most remarkable prophetic achievements, accurately forecasting the sequence of world empires from Babylon to Rome. But Daniel is more than prophecy. It's a manual for faithful living under hostile governments. From fiery furnaces to lions' dens, from mysterious dreams to apocalyptic visions, this book reveals how God's people can maintain their faith while kingdoms rise and fall around them. Jesus himself quoted Daniel when speaking about the end times, calling it essential reading for understanding the future. Tonight, we'll uncover why this ancient exile's visions still shake modern scholars and why Daniel's prophecies are the key to unlocking biblical eschatology. Get ready to see prophecy, history, and faith collide in ways you never imagined. The year was 605 BC, when everything changed forever for a young Hebrew noble named Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had just swept through Judah like a conquering storm, his armies overwhelming Jerusalem's defenses and reducing the holy city to submission. The Temple of Solomon, once the pride of Israel, now stood under foreign control. As chapter 1 verse 1 records, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it." This wasn't just another military campaign. Nebuchadnezzar had a strategic vision that went far beyond mere conquest. He understood that to truly control an empire, you needed more than soldiers and fortresses. You needed minds. The brightest, most capable people from every conquered nation should serve Babylon, bringing their knowledge and skills to strengthen his kingdom. Chapter 1 verse 3 tells us exactly what happened next. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief official, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Daniel found himself among the chosen. One moment he was living in familiar surroundings, worshipping at the temple, speaking his native language, eating foods prepared according to Hebrew customs. The next moment he was being marched hundreds of miles across desert and river, watching his homeland disappear behind him forever. But Daniel wasn't alone in this ordeal. 3 other young Hebrew nobles shared his fate: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These 4 boys, probably in their early teens, represented the cream of Hebrew society. The selection criteria were demanding. As verse 4 explains, Nebuchadnezzar wanted young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Daniel and his 3 friends met every requirement perfectly. They possessed the rare combination of natural ability, proper upbringing, and inner strength that Nebuchadnezzar's officials were seeking. The Babylonian transformation program began immediately and aggressively. First came the name Changes, a deliberate psychological assault on Hebrew identity. Daniel's name, which meant "God is my judge," was replaced with Belteshazzar, meaning Bel, protect his life, honoring the chief Babylonian deity. Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. Every new name was designed to erase their Hebrew heritage and replace it with Babylonian religious identity. Next came the educational curriculum. For 3 years, they would be immersed in the language and literature of the Babylonians. This meant learning cuneiform writing, studying Babylonian history and culture, mastering court etiquette, and absorbing the religious and philosophical systems that governed Mesopotamian life. The goal was complete cultural conversion, turning Hebrew boys into Babylonian officials who would serve the empire without question. But the most immediate challenge came with the daily routine. Verse 5 tells us that the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. This sounds generous, even luxurious. The royal diet was the finest available in the ancient world. Rich meats, exotic delicacies, aged wines, and sumptuous desserts. Any normal teenager would have considered this an incredible privilege. Daniel saw it differently. As verse 8 records with simple but profound clarity, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. This wasn't a casual preference or a minor dietary concern. This was a deliberate choice to maintain his covenant relationship with God despite enormous pressure to compromise. The problem wasn't just that the food violated Hebrew dietary laws. The larger issue was that royal food had almost certainly been offered to Babylonian gods before being served. Daniel approached Ashpenaz with a request that must have seemed absurd. When Ashpenaz expressed concern about the king's reaction, Daniel proposed something even more audacious. As verse 12 records, Daniel said to the guard, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink." But God honored their trust. Verse 15 records the stunning result. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. 2 years passed quickly in the Babylonian court. Daniel and his friends excelled in their studies, mastering the complex curriculum while maintaining their Hebrew faith in secret. They learned to navigate the dangerous waters of palace politics, serving their captors with excellence while never forgetting their true identity as servants of the God of Israel. Then came the crisis that would catapult Daniel from obscurity to the center of world power. As chapter 2 verse 1 tells us, in the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. This wasn't just insomnia or anxiety. The king had experienced something that shook him to his very core, a dream so vivid, so charged with significance, that it left him completely unsettled. But when Nebuchadnezzar woke up, he faced a maddening problem. The details of the dream had vanished from his memory like morning mist. He knew he had seen something important, something that felt prophetic and momentous, but he couldn't recall what it was. The harder he tried to remember, the more frustrated he became. In desperation, the king summoned every wise man in Babylon. The royal court was famous throughout the ancient world for its magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. These were men who claimed to communicate with gods, interpret signs, and reveal hidden mysteries. Surely they could help their king recover his forgotten dream. Nebuchadnezzar's demand, however, was unprecedented. "Tell me what my dream was and interpret it," he commanded. When the wise men protested that this was impossible, Nebuchadnezzar's response revealed the depth of his desperation and fury. Verse 5 records his terrifying ultimatum. "If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to arrest Daniel, he could have panicked. He was just a teenager, a foreign captive with no real power or influence. But Daniel's response reveals the character that God had been building in him through years of small, faithful choices. First, Daniel asked for time. Then he did something that shows the true strength of his faith. He gathered Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah for prayer. That night, God revealed the mystery to Daniel in a vision. The next morning, Daniel stood before the most powerful man on earth. The throne room of Nebuchadnezzar was designed to intimidate. Massive columns, gleaming tiles, armed guards, and courtiers who could determine a person's fate with a whisper. At the center sat the king himself, his eyes burning with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and barely controlled rage. Daniel's opening words were crucial. He could have taken credit for his insight, claimed special powers, or tried to impress the king with mysterious language. Instead, he did something that took tremendous courage and wisdom. As verse 27 records, he said, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about." With those words, Daniel swept away any possibility that human wisdom could solve this problem. Then came the revelation that would change everything. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Daniel proceeded to describe the king's dream with perfect accuracy. Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. Daniel continued with precise detail. The head was made of pure gold, brilliant and beautiful. The chest and arms were silver, strong but less valuable than gold. The belly and thighs were bronze, impressive but inferior to silver. The legs were iron, harder than bronze but lacking its beauty. Most unusual of all, the feet were a mixture of iron and clay, strong in some ways but fundamentally unstable. The king leaned forward as Daniel described the climax of the vision. A stone, cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them to pieces. The entire structure collapsed, and the wind swept away every fragment until nothing remained. But the stone that had destroyed the statue became a great mountain that filled the whole earth. Now came the interpretation that would echo through history. Daniel explained that Nebuchadnezzar himself was the head of gold. After Babylon would come 3 other kingdoms, each represented by different materials in the statue. But the most stunning revelation came at the end. In the time of those kings, Daniel declared in verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. The king was overwhelmed and acknowledged Daniel's God as the God of gods and the Lord of kings. Success and recognition, however, brought new dangers. Power creates enemies, and Daniel's 3 friends soon discovered that faithfulness to God doesn't guarantee an easy life. King Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps inspired by the golden head in his dream, decided to create a monument to his own glory that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. As chapter 3 verse 1 describes, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This wasn't just a statue, it was a statement. Standing 90 feet tall, visible for miles in every direction, the golden image proclaimed Nebuchadnezzar's power and demanded universal submission. But the king wasn't content with mere artistic display. He intended this statue to serve as a test of loyalty throughout his empire. Verse 4 tells us that a herald proclaimed loudly, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." The consequences for refusal were swift and terrible. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. When the moment came, the response was overwhelming. The music played, and as verse 7 records, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The sight must have been breathtaking. Thousands upon thousands of people prostrating themselves before the gleaming statue, a sea of submission stretching to the horizon. But 3 figures remained standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Hebrew officials whom Daniel had recommended for high positions, refused to bow. Their defiance was visible to everyone, a stark contrast against the backdrop of universal worship. The accusers wasted no time rushing to the king with their report. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. These weren't random troublemakers. They were his own appointees, men he had promoted to positions of trust and authority. Their defiance felt like personal betrayal. He summoned them immediately and gave them one final opportunity to comply. His words in verse 15 carried both threat and challenge. If you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? The 3 young men's response has inspired believers for over 2 millennia. without hesitation, without consultation, without any attempt to negotiate or compromise, they replied with words that ring with absolute conviction, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Their answer contained both faith and realism. They believed God could save them, but they were prepared to die if he chose not to. Nebuchadnezzar's fury reached a level that defied reason. Verse 19 tells us that his attitude toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego changed. His face was distorted with rage, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The king wasn't just angry, he was in a rage that bordered on madness. The furnace used for this execution was probably a large kiln used for metalworking or pottery, capable of generating intense heat. When heated 7 times beyond its normal temperature, it became a roaring inferno that could be seen and felt from a considerable distance. The heat was so intense that verse 22 records a tragic irony. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The strongest men in Nebuchadnezzar's army bound the 3 Hebrews fully clothed and carried them toward the furnace opening. As they approached the blazing entrance, the heat became unbearable. The soldiers, trained warriors accustomed to the rigors of combat, were overcome by the intensity and died before they could complete their task. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the fire, still bound, still fully clothed, apparently doomed to instant death. But then something happened that shattered every assumption about what was possible. Nebuchadnezzar, watching from his royal platform, suddenly leaped to his feet in amazement. His advisors looked on in confusion as their king stared into the furnace with an expression of absolute astonishment. "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked in verse 24. When his officials confirmed this obvious fact, Nebuchadnezzar made an announcement that defied every law of physics and human experience. "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Inside that furnace, where human life should have been extinguished in seconds, 4 figures moved with complete freedom. The 3 Hebrew men were not only alive but unbound. The ropes that had held them had been burned away, while their bodies remained completely untouched. And with them walked a 4th figure, whose appearance was so remarkable that even a pagan king recognized something divine about him. Nebuchadnezzar approached as close to the furnace as he dared and called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out." When they emerged, verse 27 describes what the assembled officials found. The fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. The fire had been completely selective in its effects. It had burned away their bonds, but left everything else untouched. Years passed, and King Nebuchadnezzar seemed to settle into a comfortable routine. His empire flourished, his palace grew more magnificent, and his power extended to the ends of the known world. The lessons of the furnace appeared to have taught him healthy respect for the God of the Hebrews, but they hadn't fundamentally changed his heart. Success and prosperity gradually eroded his memory of divine intervention. As chapter 4 verse 4 tells us, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous." The king had reached the pinnacle of human achievement. He ruled the greatest empire in history, commanded vast armies, controlled enormous wealth, and enjoyed absolute power over millions of people. From every human perspective, he had no reason for concern or dissatisfaction. It was precisely in this moment of supreme confidence that God chose to send another dream. But this vision was different from the first. Where the statue dream had revealed God's plan for world history, this new dream was intensely personal, focusing on Nebuchadnezzar himself and the spiritual danger of his pride. The king saw a tree of extraordinary size and beauty growing in the middle of the earth. As verse 11 describes it, the tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. This wasn't just any tree. It was a cosmic symbol of life and strength, providing shelter and sustenance for all creation. The tree's leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for everyone. But then the vision took a dramatic turn. A holy messenger, described as a messenger, a holy one coming down from heaven, proclaimed a terrifying judgment. Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. The destruction, however, wasn't complete, but let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground. Most mysterious of all, the messenger's proclamation shifted from talking about a tree to describing a person. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. When Nebuchadnezzar woke from this dream, he was deeply troubled. Unlike his previous vision, this one felt ominous and threatening. He summoned all his wise men, but once again they were completely helpless. Finally, Daniel came before the king. When Daniel heard the dream, his reaction was immediate and visible. Verse 19 tells us that Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. The young Hebrew understood exactly what the vision meant, and the knowledge filled him with distress. Daniel's interpretation required tremendous courage. He was about to deliver the most difficult message of his career to the most powerful man on earth. But when Nebuchadnezzar encouraged him to speak freely, Daniel fulfilled his calling as God's prophet with both honesty and compassion. "My Lord," Daniel began in verse 22, "you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth." The magnificent tree in the vision represented Nebuchadnezzar himself, his power, his influence, and his role as provider and protector for his vast empire. But then came the sobering interpretation of the tree's destruction. The cutting down meant that the king would be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The judgment wasn't arbitrary or vindictive. Its purpose was clearly stated: to teach Nebuchadnezzar that human power derives from divine authority, not personal greatness. The 7 times, probably 7 years, would continue until the king learned humility before God. Daniel's heart for the king showed in his earnest appeal for repentance. "Therefore, O king," he pleaded in verse 27, "be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." For 12 months, nothing happened. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar thought he had escaped the prophecy through reform or good behavior. Perhaps he gradually forgot the dream's warning as daily affairs demanded his attention. But God's patience had a purpose. He was giving the king every opportunity to humble himself voluntarily before judgment became necessary. The moment of truth came as Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace, surveying the magnificent city spread out below him. Babylon was breathtaking from that height, its hanging gardens, massive walls, gleaming temples, and bustling streets, all testament to human achievement and royal power. In that moment of supreme satisfaction, pride filled the king's heart completely. verse 30, records the fatal words that sealed his fate. "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The king's language revealed his heart. "I have built my mighty power, my majesty." There was no acknowledgement of divine blessing, no recognition of dependence on God, no gratitude for gifts received. The response from heaven was immediate. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." What followed was one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. Immediately, Nebuchadnezzar's sanity departed. He was driven away from human society and began living in the wilderness, eating grass like cattle. For 7 years, this condition continued. The mighty Nebuchadnezzar lived like a wild animal, while his empire somehow continued to function without him. Then, at the end of that time, as verse 34 records, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored." The first act of his restored mind was worship. His reason returned, his royal honor was restored, but Nebuchadnezzar was fundamentally changed. The pride that had caused his downfall was replaced with humble recognition of divine sovereignty. The years had passed since Nebuchadnezzar's restoration, and now his grandson Belshazzar ruled Babylon. The old king's hard-learned lessons about divine sovereignty seemed forgotten in the new generation. Belshazzar ruled with the arrogance of youth, believing himself untouchable in his magnificent palace. On the night that would change everything, Belshazzar decided to throw the most extravagant feast Babylon had ever seen. As chapter 5 verse 1 tells us, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. This wasn't just a dinner party. It was a display of wealth and power designed to impress everyone who mattered in the empire. The palace blazed with light, filled with music, laughter, and hundreds of conversations. The finest food was served on golden plates, and wine flowed freely from golden cups. The atmosphere was electric with celebration and indulgence. But as the evening progressed and the wine took effect, Belshazzar made a decision that revealed his heart's true condition. Verse 2 records what happened. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. These weren't just any cups. They were sacred vessels that had been used in the worship of the God of Israel. For decades, they had remained stored away, treated with at least minimal respect for their religious significance. But now, in his drunken state, Belshazzar decided to use them as party favors. When the sacred vessels were brought in, as verse 3 tells us, they drank from them. But they didn't stop there. Verse 4 reveals the full extent of their sacrilege. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The king and his guests were deliberately mocking the God of Israel while drinking from his holy vessels. But heaven was watching. In the midst of the laughter and music, something happened that instantly changed the atmosphere. As verse 5 records with chilling simplicity, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. Imagine the scene, hundreds of people celebrating, when suddenly a disembodied hand appears in the lampstand's light. The hand moves deliberately across the white plaster wall, writing mysterious symbols that no one can understand. The effect was immediate and devastating. Verse 6 describes Belshazzar's reaction. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The most powerful man in Babylon was reduced to trembling terror by this supernatural manifestation. The party stopped instantly, leaving only 4 words written in Aramaic script that would soon seal the fate of an empire. Terror gripped the palace as Belshazzar stared at the writing on the wall. The mysterious words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, hung there like a death sentence, but no one could understand what they meant. As verse 7 tells us, the king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners with a desperate promise of purple robes, gold chains, and high position for whoever could interpret the writing. But once again, the wise men of Babylon were completely helpless. They could read the Aramaic letters, but the meaning escaped them entirely. Their failure only increased the king's panic. Verse 8 records their complete defeat. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. It was the queen mother who remembered Daniel. As verse 10 tells us, when the queen heard the voices of the king and his nobles, she came into the banquet hall. She had lived through Nebuchadnezzar's reign and remembered the Hebrew who had solved impossible mysteries before. Her words in verse 11 carried the weight of experience. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. Daniel was summoned immediately. Now an old man, probably in his 80s, he entered the feast hall, where the sacred vessels still sat on the tables and the mysterious writing glowed on the wall. But Daniel's response, recorded in verse 17, revealed his character. You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Before interpreting the writing, Daniel delivered a stinging rebuke. He reminded Belshazzar of his grandfather's pride and humiliation, then pointed to the king's own rebellion. Verse 22 captures his bold words. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Then came the devastating interpretation. As verse 25 records, Daniel read the writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. The meaning was terrifying in its simplicity. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar kept his promise and honored Daniel with purple robes and a gold chain, making him third ruler in the kingdom. But the promotion was meaningless. As verse 30 records with chilling finality, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The mighty Babylon, unconquerable for decades, fell in a single night. The fall of Babylon brought dramatic changes to Daniel's life. At over 80 years old, he could have retired quietly, but the new Persian administration recognized his exceptional abilities. Darius the Mede appointed him as one of 3 administrators over the entire kingdom, with 120 satraps reporting to them. But Daniel's excellence soon created problems for him. As chapter 6, verse 3 tells us, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. The aging Hebrew was about to become prime minister of the Persian Empire. This prospect filled the other officials with jealousy and rage. They couldn't accept being ruled by a foreigner, especially one who served a different god. They began plotting his downfall, but faced a frustrating problem. As verse 4 records, they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Daniel's integrity was beyond question. Finally, they realized there was only one way to trap him. Verse 5 captures their conclusion. We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Daniel's faithfulness to God was his only potential weakness. The conspirators approached King Darius with a carefully crafted proposal. They suggested that he issue a decree requiring everyone to pray only to him for 30 days. As verse 7 records their flattering words, The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. The proposal appealed to Darius's ego and seemed harmless enough. What they didn't tell him was that they had deliberately excluded Daniel from their planning. This wasn't a unanimous decision. It was a trap designed specifically for one man. Darius signed the decree, and according to Persian law, it could not be changed. When Daniel learned of the decree, his response was immediate and unwavering. Verse 10 tells us exactly what he did. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Daniel didn't hide his prayers or try to find a loophole in the law. He continued exactly as he had always done. The conspirators were watching and waiting. The moment Daniel knelt to pray, they had the evidence they needed. As verse 11 records, these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. They rushed immediately to King Darius with their accusation. Their approach was clever and manipulative. First, they reminded the king of his own decree, then sprang their trap. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. The king immediately realized he had been manipulated. Verse 14 describes his distress. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Darius spent the entire day searching for legal loopholes, but the conspirators wouldn't let him escape. They returned with a cold reminder that Persian law could not be changed. With a heavy heart, the king gave the order for Daniel's arrest. As verse 16 records, the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Daniel was thrown into the den with the hungry lions, and a stone was placed over the opening. The king sealed it with his own signet ring so that nothing could be changed. But Darius couldn't rest. Verse 18 tells us, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. While Daniel spent the night with lions, the king spent it in agony. At the first light of dawn, Darius hurried to the lion's den. His cry, recorded in verse 20, reveals his desperate hope. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? The answer that came back from the den changed everything. Daniel's voice, calm and strong, called out, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king's joy was overwhelming. Verse 23 tells us, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. But the story wasn't over. At the king's command, verse 24 records the fate of Daniel's accusers. The king gave the order, and the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. The same lions that had been harmless to Daniel became instruments of divine judgment on his enemies. In the first year of Belshazzar's reign, years before the writing on the wall, Daniel received a vision that would reveal the future of world empires in dramatic detail. As chapter 7 verse 1 tells us, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. The setting of this vision was both cosmic and terrifying. Daniel found himself watching the great sea churned into violent waves by powerful winds. As verse 2 describes it, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. This wasn't an ordinary storm. The winds came from heaven itself, stirring up chaos from the depths. From this turbulent sea came four massive beasts, each different from the others, each representing a world empire that would dominate the earth. The first beast that emerged was both majestic and fearsome. Verse 4 describes it. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. This lion with eagle's wings represented Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. The tearing off of wings and the giving of a human mind clearly pointed to the king's 7 years of madness and subsequent restoration. The second beast was completely different. As verse 5 tells us, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." This bear, raised up on one side, represented the Medo-Persian Empire, with one side, Persia, being stronger than the other, Media. The third beast brought speed and expansion. Verse 6 describes it. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. The leopard with 4 wings represented the lightning-fast conquests of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. The 4 heads pointed to the 4 divisions of his empire after his death. But it was the 4th beast that filled Daniel with the greatest dread. As verse 7 records, after that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. This beast was so terrible that Daniel couldn't compare it to any known animal. It was a monster of pure destruction with iron teeth. As Daniel watched the 4th beast in horror, his attention was drawn to an even more remarkable sight. The scene shifted from earth to heaven, from chaos to perfect order. What he saw next would become one of the most significant prophetic visions in all of Scripture. Verse 9 describes the heavenly courtroom that suddenly appeared. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. This was God himself, eternal and holy, taking his place as the supreme judge of all the earth. The imagery was overwhelming in its majesty. Verse 10 continues, a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him, 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. This wasn't just a vision of God's throne. It was the ultimate courtroom where all earthly powers would be judged. As Daniel watched, the 4th beast met its end. Verse 11 tells us, then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The monster that had terrorized the earth was destroyed by divine judgment. But then came the most stunning part of the vision. As verse 13 records, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. This mysterious figure, looking like a human being but coming with divine clouds, approached God's throne. The transfer of authority that followed would change everything. Verse 14 describes what happened. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power, All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Unlike the temporary earthly empires represented by the beasts, this kingdom would be eternal. The Son of Man would rule forever over all peoples and nations. His authority wouldn't be taken by conquest or lost through defeat. It was given by God himself and would never end. Daniel was deeply troubled by what he had seen. As verse 16 tells us, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. The heavenly being who explained the vision made it clear that the four beasts represented four kingdoms that would arise from the earth. But verse 18 contained the ultimate hope. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. 2 years later, in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign, Daniel received another vision that would provide even more specific details about future world empires. This time, he found himself transported to a specific location. As chapter 8 verse 2 tells us, in my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. The setting was significant. Susa would later become one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire, and Daniel was seeing events that would unfold in that very location. As he stood by the canal, he witnessed a confrontation between two powerful animals that represented mighty nations. The first animal to appear was a ram with an unusual feature. Verse 3 describes it, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. The horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. This ram's mismatched horns told a story of 2 powers joined together, with one becoming dominant. The ram's behavior revealed its character. As verse 4 records, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. This was a picture of overwhelming military success and expanding empire. But the ram's dominance wouldn't last forever. From the west came a challenger that moved with incredible speed. Verse 5 describes this new arrival. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. The image of crossing the earth without touching the ground emphasized the extraordinary speed of this conquest. The confrontation between the ram and the goat was swift and decisive. Verse 6 tells us, it came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. The outcome was devastating for the ram. As verse 7 records, I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat's victory was complete and total. But the goat's triumph contained the seeds of its own destruction. Verse 8 reveals what happened next. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. The great horn that had achieved such spectacular victory was suddenly broken, representing the death of a great conqueror at the peak of his power. From one of the 4 horns that replaced the great horn, something new and ominous began to emerge. As verse 9 tells us, out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. This little horn would become more significant than its small beginning suggested. The growth of this little horn was both geographical and spiritual. It expanded militarily toward the south and east, but its most troubling characteristic was its assault on religious worship. Verse 10 describes its audacious rebellion. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. But the little horn's arrogance reached even higher. Verse 11 reveals the full extent of its blasphemy. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. This wasn't just political conquest. It was an attack on God himself and his worship. The impact on true religion was devastating. As verse 12 records, because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. The little horn didn't just conquer territory, it corrupted truth itself. As Daniel watched this disturbing vision unfold, he overheard a conversation between two holy beings. One asked a crucial question, recorded in verse 13. How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. The answer came with stunning precision. Verse 14 records the response. It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. This wasn't just a general time period. It was an exact countdown to the restoration of proper worship. Daniel was overwhelmed by what he had seen. The vision was so intense and the implications so staggering that his physical body couldn't handle it. As verse 27 tells us, I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. But God didn't leave his prophet in confusion. The angel Gabriel was sent to provide interpretation. As verse 17 records, Gabriel told him, Understand, Son of Man, that the vision concerns the time of the end. This wasn't just about immediate future events. It pointed to the ultimate conclusion of human history. Gabriel's explanation was clear and specific. The ram with two horns represented the kings of Media and Persia. The goat represented the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes was the first king. The four horns that replaced it were four kingdoms that would emerge from the Greek nation. The little horn would be a king who would arise in the latter part of their reign, destroyed not by human power. The 2,300 days would mark the period of desecration before the sanctuary would be cleansed and proper worship restored. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, when Daniel was well into his 80s, he received what would be his final and most comprehensive revelation. As chapter 10 verse 1 tells us, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. But this revelation came only after intense spiritual preparation. Daniel had been mourning for 3 full weeks. As verse 2 records, At that time I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. During this period, Daniel practiced complete self-denial. Verse 3 describes his discipline. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. On the 24th day of the 1st month, Daniel was standing by the great Tigris River when something extraordinary happened. The vision was so overwhelming that his companions fled in terror. As verse 7 tells us, I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. What Daniel saw defied description. Verse 5 begins his account. I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. But this was no ordinary man. Verse 6 continues, His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. The effect on Daniel was devastating. This was the same prophet who had faced lions without trembling, but in the presence of this glorious being, he was completely undone. Verse 8 describes his condition. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale and I was helpless. When the glorious being spoke, Daniel was overwhelmed. As verse 9 records, "Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. But then a gentle hand touched Daniel and helped him to his hands and knees. The being's first words were encouraging. 'Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you.' What the being revealed next opened a window into the invisible spiritual war behind world events. He explained why Daniel's prayers had been delayed. 'Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them.' But then came the stunning revelation. Verse 13 contains one of the most remarkable verses in Scripture. 'But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia.' This revealed that powerful spiritual beings are assigned to earthly kingdoms, and these beings can conflict with God's purposes. The Prince of Persia wasn't a human ruler, but a demonic power with authority over the Persian Empire. For 21 days, exactly the length of Daniel's fast, this spiritual battle had raged in the invisible realm. Michael, described as one of the chief princes, was the archangel who serves as Israel's protector. Without Michael's intervention, the angelic messenger would have remained trapped in spiritual combat. This explains why God sometimes seems slow to answer prayer. There are spiritual battles being fought that we cannot see. With this spiritual context established, the angel began to unfold the most detailed prophecy in the Bible. Starting from Daniel's time, he would reveal the exact sequence of events over the next several centuries. As chapter 11 verse 2 begins, "Now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. This 4th king would use his wealth to stir up conflict with Greece, setting in motion the wars Daniel had seen in earlier visions. The angel then described the mighty king whose empire would be divided. Then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven." What followed was a detailed description of wars between 2 of these divisions, the kingdom of the north, Syria, and the kingdom of the south, Egypt. These became known as the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties, and their conflicts would dominate Middle Eastern politics for centuries. The angel described how the king of the south would become strong, but one of his commanders would become even stronger. He told of alliances through marriage that would fail, of invasions and counter-invasions, of fortresses captured and treasures plundered. The level of detail was extraordinary, covering years of peace and conflict. But the most significant figure was yet to come. The angel spoke of a contemptible person who would not be given royal honor, but would seize the kingdom through intrigue. This figure would become the most detailed subject of the prophecy, because his actions would prefigure the final enemy of God's people. The contemptible person, mentioned in verse 21, would prove to be one of history's most notorious enemies of the Jewish people. The angel described how he would come to power. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. This ruler would be cunning and deceptive, using flattery and false promises to gain power. As verse 23 tells us, after coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. Initially, he would be successful in his military campaigns, but verse 28 contains an ominous note. His heart will be set against the holy covenant. The turning point would come during a second invasion of the south. Verse 30 explains, "Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant." Frustrated by military failure, this king would turn his rage against the Jewish people and their religion. The angel described the terrible persecution that would follow. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. This abomination of desolation would be the ultimate blasphemy, placing a pagan idol in the holy temple, making worship impossible for faithful Jews. The angel described how this king would corrupt those who violated the covenant through flattery, but also how the people who know their God will firmly resist him. The persecution would be severe, but verse 35 gives hope. "Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time." At verse 36, the prophecy takes a dramatic turn. The angel began to describe someone even more sinister, a king who would appear at the time of the end. This final ruler would make all previous enemies look tame by comparison. The angel's description was chilling. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. This wasn't just another dictator. This was someone who would claim divine status. Verse 37 reveals his rebellion. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Yet, despite his divine claims, verse 38 describes his true devotion. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. This king would use military might to attack and conquer, but his reign would not go unchallenged. The angel described a final conflict. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. The king would invade many countries like a flood, but verse 44 says, "Reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many." The end would come suddenly. Verse 45 describes his final moments. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. The death of the final king would mark the beginning of the most dramatic period in human history. As chapter 12 verse 1 declares, "At that time Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of trouble such as never was since nations began up to that time." This would be Michael's moment. The archangel who had fought spiritual battles behind the scenes would finally step forward openly. His intervention would signal that God's patience with human rebellion had reached its end. But this trouble would not touch everyone equally. The verse continues, "But at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered." Then would come the event faithful people had hoped for throughout history. Verse 2 describes it. "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Death itself would be conquered, and all who had ever lived would live again." This resurrection would not be universal salvation. There would be two distinct groups, those awakening to eternal life and those awakening to eternal judgment. Those who had been faithful would receive special honor. Verse 3 tells us, "Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." The angel commanded Daniel to preserve this revelation. "But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end." This prophecy was not meant for Daniel's generation alone. It was a message for those who would live in the final days. As the vision continued, Daniel noticed two other figures standing on opposite sides of the river. One asked the man dressed in linen a question burning in Daniel's heart. How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? The answer came with the most solemn oath possible. Verse 7 records, "The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. And I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, 'It will be for a time, times and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed.'" This time, times and half a time, 3.5 years, would be the duration of the final persecution. It would be a specific, limited period, after which God would intervene decisively. Daniel heard this, but didn't understand its full meaning. His honest confession in verse 8 reveals his humanity. "I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, 'My Lord, what will the outcome of all this be?'" The reply was both mysterious and encouraging. Verse 9 tells us, he replied, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end." The angel gave Daniel additional details about time periods. Verse 11 mentions 1,290 days from when the daily sacrifice is abolished. Verse 12 adds, "Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days." These specific numbers indicated that God operates according to a precise timetable. As the vision drew to a close, Daniel found himself overwhelmed by all he had seen. The prophecies stretched from his own time to the very end of the world, covering centuries of conflict, persecution, and finally, divine intervention and resurrection. The angel's final words to Daniel were both realistic and comforting. Daniel was now an old man, probably in his 90s, and his earthly journey was nearly over. He would not live to see most of the events revealed to him, but this did not diminish their importance. Verse 13 contains God's final message to his faithful prophet. "As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." This was both a command and a promise. Daniel was to continue living faithfully until his natural death, trusting that God would take care of the future. The promise of resurrection was personal and specific. Daniel would rest in death, but this rest would not be permanent. At the end of the days, when all prophecies were fulfilled and human history reached its conclusion, Daniel would rise again. He would receive his allotted inheritance, his reward for a lifetime of faithful service. This was the perfect ending to Daniel's remarkable story. The young man taken captive to Babylon had remained faithful through multiple kingdoms and rulers. He had interpreted dreams, survived persecution, received visions, and recorded prophecies that would guide God's people through the centuries ahead. The book closes with Daniel presumably returning to his normal duties, carrying with him the secrets of the future, but trusting in God's perfect timing for their fulfillment. He had been shown the end from the beginning, and he knew that God's purposes would prevail. If this deep dive into Daniel has opened your eyes to the incredible precision of biblical prophecy and the faithfulness of God throughout history, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. There are so many more biblical treasures waiting to be discovered together. Did this video change how you see the book of Daniel? Share it with someone who needs to hear about God's sovereignty over world events. Your share could be exactly what someone needs to strengthen their faith today. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of Daniel's story impacted you the most. Was it his courage in the lion's den, the amazing accuracy of his prophecies, or maybe the promise that those who are wise will shine like stars forever? Thank you for joining me on this prophetic journey through Daniel. Until next time, remember, Just like Daniel, God has a plan for your life, and his kingdom will have the final word.